Well, welcome. This is the fourth chapter's scriptures reading session. And today I thought we'd just review what we've covered over the first three sessions, chapters 1, 2, 3. And just trying to be as candid as possible, not trying to be controversial, just looking at things that seem to stand out and sharing them. And hopefully this will get other people reading the Bible. And I'll just make a note here. It's true that the version of the Bible that we're reading has been edited and produced, this particular version by King James. So yes, there could be parts of it that are not matching the original text, and maybe further down the road, we could look more at some of the original translations. And there are lots of people who may want to share with us some of their findings in their research. But just staying with the King James Version, I'll just bring this up on the screen so you can see it with me. In chapter 1, we notice that in verse 2, there's a discussion about the void. And in verse 2, the earth was present. It was there. It didn't have any form, but there was something there, which the Lord put the Spirit into it. And there was water there already, because the Spirit was moved upon the face of the water. So there was something there, which I think is very interesting. The other point I notice here in verse 3, the light, let there be light, and there was light present. And this is referred to again in chapter 4, verse 4 rather, that the light divided the darkness. So there was a split already. And the definition of day and night in verse 5 was created. So this is like 3 verses so far that are dedicated to the creation of light. And I think this is important because at no point, this is before there was a firmament, because it's not until the second day, in verse 6, that the Lord created the firmament, and he created it in the midst of the waters, which were, again apparently still existing. And then went on to divide the waters from the waters that were above and the waters that were below, so on. And that's where, on the second day, the firmament was created and designated as heaven. It goes on, now we're into the third day, and this is where the Lord revealed the earth. By gathering the waters together, the land was allowed to dry, and it appeared. This is in verse 9. And in verse 10, he designated this dry land as being earth. And still goes on. And there was the creation then of grass and herbs and fruit. It's in verse 11. And verse 12, there were reference to seeds and yielding seeds of his kind. And I think I mentioned it when I did the reading that there seems to be this thing that the seeds were either there in the earth or were put in the earth, right? And then it goes on in verse 14, where the lights were put in place, and the sun and the moon were put in place, which I think was interesting. So the stars were put in place, and that was in verse 14 and 15. And then in 16, this is where the moon and the sun were put in place. And this goes on in a discussion about the function and the rule of the sun and the moon in verse 18. And that was all on the fourth day. So the sun wasn't created. The sun and moon weren't created until the fourth day, and yet there was light on the first day. So where is this light coming from? That's what I'd like to know. And there's a lot of discussions about the fact that before the sun is visible, there's light in the sky. So there seems to be light present. Okay. And then in verse 20, it goes on to talk about the waters and creatures and creating, the fowl of the sky and so on like that. And I found this interesting because it doesn't refer to these creatures as being created here. It talks about, say in verse 21, after their kind, and every winged fowl after his kind. And there's a continued reference to them being as of an existing kind. Same thing in 24, talking about cattle and creeping things and the beasts of the earth after his kind. So there's something that's being duplicated. That's my impression anyway. And it goes on. Those are the main points. Now there are other things that would be of great interest, but I thought those would be the key ones there. Then when we go on to chapter 2, so the chapter starts off saying, well, the heavens and the earth were finished, and all of the hosts of them. So everything was in place. And this is where God took his rest. And the seventh day, the Lord took the rest. And then it goes on, it talks about, in verse 4, there are generations of heavens and of the earth when they were created. There were generations. In the day that the Lord made the earth and the heavens. And that would require more thought and research. But the idea of generations of heavens. Okie dokie. And then it goes on to talk about creating rain to create this, to get the seed to sprout and grow. And let's see here. In verse 7, the Lord formed the dust of the ground and breathed into his nostrils the breath of life. And man became a living soul. So man was created from the ground. Okay, well, that's kind of a little bit different than what was in verse 1, but it gives a different feeling for the beasts of the earth, or the critters of the earth, than man. So he didn't say that about the critters, the animals, and the birds of the fowl. He did say that about man. And so this is where, in verse 8, it talks about Eden. And I thought this was all very interesting, and it mentions specific rivers. And go down here, talks about gold being of that land. We know that there is a land that had lots of gold. And it's mentioned here in verse 13 with this Ethiopia. Look at the map. Ethiopia is located here in sort of the middle of Africa to the west, so the furthest west of Africa. And you can see here the Gulf of Eden and the Red Sea and the various rivers flowing through here. Again, I thought that specific reference to Ethiopia very interesting. Then it goes on, there's another reference further down here, which is to the Euphrates. There it is there in verse 14. And the fourth river is the Euphrates. And the Euphrates is running down, and there's the Tigris, there's the Mediterranean, there's the Red Sea, and Ethiopia would be down here. So the Euphrates is to the west of Ethiopia. So we kind of have this area with the Red Sea, Ethiopia, and this is probably Iraq area where the Eden was supposed to be located. Okay, so this is again here in 17 where there's talks about the two trees, the tree of knowledge and the tree of good and evil. And let's see, the tree of life and the tree of good and evil. And the tree of knowledge, good and evil, you should not eat. And there's a section here where it talks about Adam naming all the animals and the critters. And it's down in verse 22, where 21 and 22, where it talks about the Lord taking the rib out of Adam. And as he was asleep, and then from the rib, the Lord made a woman and brought her to Adam. And there's a whole section there where they're basically innocent, and they were as one, and they were joined. And the thing I noticed in the last verse, they were not ashamed of their nakedness; they were just who they were. End of chapter 2. And chapter 3, the classic story of man falling from grace. And it's a classic one. Right at the top in verse 1 as a reference to the serpent and the conversation that the serpent had with Eve. Well, it's not Eve yet, it's called the woman. And tempting her, convincing her to eat of the tree of knowledge. And perhaps something interesting here is that this was the first deception that, yeah, nothing's going to happen. It's okay to do this. And then, it gets really bad because she eats it and gets Adam to eat it. And that's where things have caused problems. And they immediately became aware of their nakedness and covered themselves up, covered themselves up. So goes down here, and it was in verse 8. It talks about they heard the voice of the Lord walking in the garden. Now, that's kind of a strange concept. The voice walking, not the Lord walking, heard the voice of the Lord walking. Well, something to think about. And that's where they hid themselves, and the discussion then takes place between the Lord and Adam. Why did you do it? And then Adam blames the woman, says, he said, I heard the voice in the garden, I was afraid. And he said, well, what did you do? And, talks about that. And then Adam says, the woman who you gave me, she made me eat of the tree. And I guess the Lord wasn't going to buy any of that, and turned to the woman and said, okay, what have you got to say? And the woman blamed it on the serpent. The serpent beguiled me. And this is where there's a lot of discussion. Why the term beguiled, not tricked or lied? This implies that, and I think in book of Enoch, it goes into more description of what actually happened between the woman and the serpent, and that's where there's the actual betrayal. And then it goes on where the Lord then starts to curse and puts a curse on the serpent, then turns to the woman and puts a curse on her. She'll be in pain and sorrow from conception, and finally turns to Adam. And for Adam, kind of makes it look like Adam's going to have to work real hard from now on. And everything he does, there'll be thorns, like in verse 18, thorns and also thistles shall it bring unto thee, forth to thee, and thou shalt eat the herbs of the field. And the sweat on his face, he's going to have to really work, and it's going to be, until he goes back to the dust. Now, this is where Eve's name comes in verse 20. So the woman wasn't Eve until Adam called her Eve, because she was the mother of all living things. I thought that was just thrown there, kind of interesting. Eve, the mother of all living things, not the mother of all humans, mother of all living things. Then in verse 21, that's where there's a reference to the Lord made coats of skin and clothed them. And that's an interesting with it. The Lord actually gave them clothes. And in 22, there's a statement that I thought was very interesting. Behold, the man is become of one of us. So maybe by eating the tree of knowledge, Adam and Eve had become like gods, become like one of us, to know good and evil. So the Lord knew good and evil. And because of that, he will have to take also the tree of life and eat and live forever. So I'm not too sure. I'll have to reread 21, but there's a lot in there implying that, behold, the man is become as one of us. Then in 23, God kicked them out of the garden, sent them forth from the Garden of Eden, and they have to work. They got to till the ground for one second. And then in the last verse in chapter 3, something very interesting. So he drove out man, and he placed at the east of the Garden of Eden, at the east of the Garden of Eden, a cherubim. I'll have to look up what a cherubim is, but it seems to me that that's a creature that you don't want to meet. I'll look it up later. And a flaming sword, which turned in every direction, almost like a blade or some kind of rotating device, to keep the way of the tree of life. So there's now a barrier. So the tree of life is still there. And it was the tree of knowledge that Adam and Eve ate. But now they can't get to the tree of life. And there's something, maybe everlasting life or some nourishment. But that's pretty much the review of chapters 1 through 3. It's my review. I know I didn't cover everything, and I probably didn't go as deep as I would like. But it's just actually, I'll be honest with you, I'm doing this really selfishly because I really haven't done this before ever, even though I have had a Bible since I was a child. I never really read it and contemplate on it. And I find this extremely interesting. Just these 3 chapters, so much in it to think about. And I just want to share it. So hopefully people will start to get on board and we can have some interesting discussions. As I said, when I get all the wrinkles out of this, I will start to do these live so we can have some live interaction. So until then, again, thank you for watching.